Sometimes a figure is so incredible that it inspires me to make a diorama. And this Hiya Toys Rambo is one of the greatest I've ever held in my hands. So in today's video, I'm going to take on my most ambitious diorama yet and recreate a scene from one of my favorite movies, Rambo First Blood. I want to go big with this, so I'm going to make something inspired by the mountain gorge scene from the movie. I start with a piece of 2-inch thick XPS foam, which will serve as my base. This piece is about 18.5 inches wide by 17.5 inches deep. I want this diorama to have a resin poured riverbed in the front area, so I use a handheld hot wire cutter to start shaping out that area. But that only gets me so far, so I turn to a handheld box cutter and then a heat gun to form the riverbed area foundation. Once that's done, I grab a material I rarely use in diorama builds. Good old run-of-the-mill flaky white styrofoam sheets. This stuff doesn't carve well with a knife, but carves very easily using a hot wire. It's also very lightweight, so I think it's the perfect material to build the structure of my mountain gorge. So I use the hot wire to cut out the contour of the gorge on 19 pieces of styrofoam and stack them on top of each other to make sure things are looking the way I like. I want the back of the diorama to have a smooth professional finish, so I need to use the hot wire to cut some uniform edges. But the Proxxon hot wire cutting table has some very real height limitations. As a workaround, I glue manageable sections together and cut the back edges one section at a time. Once those sections are cut, I glue them all together, creating the gigantic mountainous structure that will define this piece. But the white foam doesn't look anything like a mountain rock wall, so I decided to carve up some XPS foam that could be glued onto the styrofoam to achieve a more realistic look. I made sure to reference the rock formations that appear in the movie scenes to try and replicate the appropriate rock structure for my diorama. In order to achieve that kind of look, I borrowed a rock carving technique I learned from watching fellow YouTuber Small World Workshop, where I cut a series of horizontal and vertical lines in the foam and then used my fingers to peel away what was carved one layer at a time. This technique is awesome, but it takes a long time when you're making something as large as I am in this project. So I did this over and over and over again, and then I did it some more. Okay, you get the idea, it took a long time. I wanted to have a variety in terms of the sizes and shapes of my rock face pieces because things are rarely uniform in nature. I glued the rock pieces onto the white styrofoam progressively as I finished carving them, basically playing a game of three-dimensional Tetris to cover as much of the styrofoam as possible. I chose to use hot glue to fix the pieces in place, not because it has the best hold, it doesn't, but because I was running low on Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo, and because this isn't going to be the sole thing that holds my faux rocks in place. I'll be using plaster and lightweight wall spackle later to help increase the sturdiness. In the movie, this ragtag group of local law enforcement all-stars are seen standing atop the gorge, so I wanted to make sure this diorama had a finished cliff top to recreate those kinds of scenes with action figures. That meant I needed to cover the top of the styrofoam area using the same technique I used to create the rock face. After I finished that, I used my handheld hot wire cutter to clean up the sides of the rock wall to my liking, because I also wanted to cover those with carved XPS faux rock. You may have noticed that I haven't glued the rock wall to the base yet, and there's a reason for that. I was concerned about having the 2-inch XPS foam serve as the base of this, especially because of the added weight the resin pour would create. So I purchased a large particle board sheet from Home Depot, sized it up to the dimensions of the base, cut it, and sanded it down. Then I checked my work by dry fitting the XPS base to the particle board, and everything lined up perfectly. That's when I decided to use the last remaining bit of Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo and some hot glue to permanently attach the rock wall to the base. My thinking was that the hot glue will give me an immediate hold, while the Styro Goo would give me a stronger bond as it cured over time. Now it's time to permanently attach the particle board base to the XPS foam using liquid nails, an adhesive compound that contractors use to bond insulation foam board to wood during building construction. which is actually exactly what I did when I insulated my workshop. So I loaded up my caulk gun and applied the liquid nails to the particle board base, spreading it around with a piece of scrap XPS foam. Then I placed the diorama on top of it, weighed it down, and let it dry for several hours. When it was dry, I flipped the diorama on its side and drilled screws of various sizes into the base, making sure that the screws weren't long enough to poke through the XPS foam. I felt like I needed to add in some sort of rubble and other rock formations to blend the wall into the base, so I cut some loose pieces of XPS foam, did the similar carving technique that I showed before, and then applied them to different areas of the base that I thought made sense. One of the best ways to increase the strength of a terrain piece is to use a plaster of Paris mixture, which for me consists of plaster, water, acrylic paint, and Mod Podge. I mixed it to a brushable consistency and then used a large brush to apply it all over the diorama and let it dry for slightly more than 24 hours before applying some lightweight wall spackle to hide some of the unwanted seam lines that the XPS Tetris approach created. The rock formations in the movie have a decent amount of deep chasms, so I didn't choose to fill in all of the gaps between my rocks. I just filled the ones that I felt looked like they didn't belong. As that was drying, I grabbed some Mod Podge and applied it to the base of the piece so I could add some dirt that I gathered up from the backyard and some aquarium rocks to create a more believable shoreline terrain. I also added some dirt to the mountain top and some exposed areas of the rock wall. I doused all of the dirt areas with a Mod Podge water solution, sprayed those areas with isopropyl alcohol, and let it dry in the sun for several hours. And now it's time to paint this thing, and believe it or not, we are not going to be needing this. That's because we're going to prime and base coat this with spray paint, which is only possible because I plastered the whole piece. Spray paint melts XPS foam, but it will work just fine on a hardened plaster surface. Once that dried, I turned to a series of acrylic washes made up of cheap acrylic paint and water to paint this diorama in a realistic way. The way I see it, rock walls like this are weathered in nature by wind and water that runs down its surface, leaving different minerals behind as they drip down and dry off, which causes color variation at the surface of the rock. So the logical approach in my mind was to replicate that in my paint technique. That's why I opted for these dropper bottles that I found on Amazon to apply my paint washes. As far as colors go, I used white, gray, brown, desert sand, and black. Painting this way takes a long time because you're only adding a subtle hint of color with each wash application, but the results are hard to argue with. I also found painting this way to be very therapeutic because it wasn't really reliant on my skill, but more so on the forces of gravity. And speaking of gravity, most of my washes ended up dripping down into the base, which worked in my favor, allowing me to start getting paint application on the shoreline area of the dio. I got to the point on the rock wall where I was starting to feel close to done, and that's when I used a spray bottle to cover the entire thing with a black wash. In my opinion, this was the final step to achieving the look that I wanted. The final thing to do was finish doing wash applications to the base, which I did using the desert sand color. That's it for the paint job, but there's still quite a bit more work to be done, starting with the vegetation. I started with these Woodland Scenics dark green clumps to represent larger vegetation, using Mod Podge to glue it down and then Mod Podge water solution after it was in place. Then I used some of this loose vine-like stuff that I found in the floral section of Hobby Lobby in a few strategic areas. The last piece of this step was to use my Woodland Scenic blended turf to apply my lighter moss throughout the diorama. I did this by first applying Mod Podge, then applying the turf, and then once again using the Mod Podge water solution to seal everything down. I let all of that dry in the sun and then tried to muster up enough courage to tackle the most stressful part of this build, the resin pour. This is only the second time that I've done a resin pour in a diorama, and it's actually the first that I'm pouring clear resin, so I was nervous. So much so that I reached out to my favorite YouTuber, Boylei Hobby Time, for his advice. He was kind enough to walk me through the process and boost my confidence, so I charged forward. I applied acrylic sheets to the sides of the diorama using clear silicone adhesive, which needed to cure for 24 hours before the pour. And then it was time to mix the 2-part epoxy resin, stir it up, and pour it in place. And to my genuine horror, I discovered a rather large resin leak.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
In a panic, I cleaned things up as best I could and reached back out to Boylei to see if he had any suggestions to salvage things. Fortunately, he did. The resin I mixed was toast, but he advised me that the leaked resin would actually seal the gaps that caused the leak, and that if I shored up the edges with the silicone adhesive, I could try again after letting that cure. So that's what I did. And then it was time for the moment of truth. Resin pour, take 2. I didn't see any leaks this time, so I started the fun of popping bubbles with my heat gun using the low heat setting and then let it cure for 48 hours. I was overjoyed to see that I had salvaged this resin pour and had a fully cured piece. Then I removed the acrylic dam and trimmed the surface area of the resin pool with my X-Acto knife. I mentioned earlier that I wanted this diorama to have a professional finish. So for the first time, I'll be using some wooden veneer to cover the unsightly edges and back of the piece and painting it with black paint.
Will! Looks like he wants to turn himself in.
There's one man dead! It's not my fault! I don't want any more hurt!
Freeze! Stand right where you are! Give yourself up!
But I didn't do anything!
I'm warning you, boy, don't make a move, I'll blow your head off!
I didn't do anything! Oh!
Cease fire! Cease fire!
So there you have it, my fully finished Rambo First Blood gorge diorama. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd like to give a huge shout out to Boylei Hobby Time, who really helped me salvage the resin pour on this diorama and was extremely generous with his time and his knowledge. If you guys haven't checked out his channel, he has one of the best on YouTube for diorama content, and I highly recommend. And if you enjoyed this video, I'd ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can see more awesome videos like this one here.
Vasco Toys. Action figure dioramas and props.